Hello, friends of the paranormal. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Ghost Lady of Pennsylvania, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I'm doing well for someone. I've said this before, someone in my advanced age. So
Well,
we'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this episode. And if you will look in the description, you'll find everything paranormalist podcast related, Facebook groups, links to various things that may come up during the episode. Like last time, we had a link for a story that Patty had, and we have our email address, paranormalist at the paranormalistpodcast.com, where you can send us your ideas, your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing. If you are subscribed, thank you very much. And I'm tired of talking, just generally. I'm tired in general, so I want to hear you talk for a while. So what's our topic for today?
so today we're going to talk about goblins for a little
Okay.
while.
hmm
It is a fascinating subject, and I ran across this story about, of all places, Zimbabwe.
Wow.
And they were talking about how in Zimbabwe in 2018 there was a village, and I'm not even going to attempt to say the name of it. It's Ziqaweni, so Zagawini or something like that.
When I find it, I'll put it down below.
So they were fighting they actually were attacked by goblins.
Okay.
So according to the story, the chieftain of the area, they had these little green men with bulbous noses, who were attacking and killing livestock and possibly 2 children.
Oh, okay.
So these are how they described them as ugly magical creatures, much like gnomes, but angrier. And they would steal jewelry, they would take shiny objects, but they would also turn invisible, and they're believed to possibly have been the reason that 2 young children died, who died for no apparent reason, and that farmers in this little village had lost, as of the date of this writing, which was September 2018, 30 cattle.
Very recent. That's amazing.
Yeah, we'll get into older stories, but I found this really interesting because they're talking about it. There's actually newspaper articles. I found 3 articles on this, and they were asking every person who lived in the village to do a cleansing ceremony to stop the terror, because 30 cattle is a substantial amount of cattle for 3 or 4 or 5 farmers to lose. That's a huge loss income wise. And of course, you can't put a price on the children if that's what happened to the children as well.
Right.
And so they're talking about this, and one of the things they say is that the goblins were accused of throwing stones. In 2014, the police station was evacuated due to goblin infestation, and the girls' school in the area was also evacuated. They thought that they had gotten it under control, but they hadn't. They said that these particular goblins had the ability to transform from dwarves into baboons, and there were so many unexpected problems because they didn't really know what to do with them at first. They did find that these things responded to religious words, so prayers and readings of the Bible, and that they evacuated this, as I said, that school, because the girls were under attack. This was a girls' school for like 12 and up. And that then it went away for a couple years, and then it comes back really heavy in 2018, and it gets to the point where now it's not just stuff being stolen, rocks thrown by these little beings and what have you. It's literally killing these animals and draining them of their blood.
Wow.
And so I started looking at got curious and I thought, is there a type of goblin that does that? And I came up with one. Yes, there is. There's actually a type of goblin. It's a little bit larger, which makes sense when I talk about them being larger beings, that it's called a red hat. And it's called a red hat because it dips its hat in blood after murdering whatever it kills. And the legend goes that if the hats dry out and there's no more blood on them, that they will die. So they must keep their hats wet with blood. And they are known on the British Scottish border. That's where they're originally from. It's interesting to find something. They don't say they're the same being, but they use a lot of the same tactics. They're larger than normal dwarves or goblins, and they're more aggressive. They don't talk about the red hats in Zimbabwe, but there are types of these goblins that do murder and kill, and this is the one that predominantly comes up. So I thought that was a fascinating story. And that's kind of what got me started on the goblins. And I started poking around a little bit. You know how I do. I fall down a rabbit hole and then I start seeing where else I can go. And when we traditionally think of stories of goblins and stuff like that as European, that's a European myth. But what I became aware of throughout this process was that it's not just a European myth. In China, they have goblins. In Japan, they have goblins. In Korea, there are goblins. They dress differently, which makes perfect sense, but they do pretty much the same things. They are shapeshifters. They are able to disappear, become invisible. They play tricks, a lot of them. Some of them are helpful, some of them are very not helpful. And then there's a violent group of them that come out, and they're all over the world. Native Americans had them. Every place you go, South America has them. You go to Lapland, they have them. Everywhere you look, there's these stories. So they're universal. And the interesting part is every one of them describes certain things the same way. So the things that they describe the same way always are the size, pretty much, the shape of them, often the color's the same, the actions, like if they're mischievous or if they're murderous or what have you. Okay. And one other thing, they almost always are said to live underground. There are stories in Europe of them being captured, goblins, and being forced to work in mines or dig tunnels under the ground in the Middle Ages. And that one of the reasons they don't like humans is because they were caught and used for slave labor. And that is because there are certain magical ways you can control them. We're going to talk a little bit about that throughout this. So this isn't your normal stories. I'm trying really hard to get to a place where we're telling these different types of stories in places where there were no mines, whether they were coal mines or iron ore mines or tunnels that needed to be used. They also were known to be captured and forced to work in the forest. So say, it was an area where there was a lot of trees, and you were going to sell them to somebody who has a mine to shore up the mine, they would be put to work there too. And they were really angry about that. And these are stories of this all throughout the Middle Ages and what have you. So some of the stories about the capturing I thought were really interesting. There's a story about one of these little people, a story from northern Wales, and the story is about a hunter who was going to capture a fox. So they would, I don't know, for those who don't know, fox live in holes in the ground called dens. So, I know we have some folks who live in cities and places like that. Maybe they don't know a whole lot about foxes. I have some fox that live about 12 miles up the road from me, and I get to see the kits coming in and out of their hole not too far from the highway. So I get to watch them from time to time. Anyway, they come from holes. So what they would do is they would put a bag over the hole. Eventually the animal would have to come out, and because there's nowhere else for it to go, they don't have a back door, and you catch it. So they were looking for fox. So they placed a bag over the mouth of the entrance of the den, and they waited for, sat back a little bit and waited for it to happen. They finally fell asleep waiting because it was taking so long. And when they woke up, there was a commotion as this thing had gotten caught up in the bag. They weren't fully anticipating a fox. You can imagine. They grab up the bag, and a fox is a dangerous animal. It'll bite you, and it's not going to be a happy camper now that it's in a bag. So they grab up the bag, tie it shut, and they start heading for home because they're going to, kill it and take the furs and use the furs. And they hear from behind them a tiny voice, and it says, "Where is my son John?" And there's these footsteps, little tiny footsteps tapping along, and they don't turn around, and they hear it again. And it's, "Where is my son John?" And from inside the bag, they hear a voice say, "That's my dear father calling me." And at that point, they dropped the bag and ran off. And I would imagine that Dad got the young fella out of the bag. But there are literally hundreds of those kinds of stories where somebody was trying to catch a fox or was hunting and the wrong thing, got caught in the trap. There's a story in Suffolk called Brother Mike. It's a story of a farmer who caught a goblin, and it was stealing corn in his barn. So he caught it like pilfering, and he puts the creature in his in a little cell and takes it back to the farmhouse for his amusement of his children. He thinks they'll be wowed by this thing. So captive, it's literally tethered is the word they use. So tied to the kitchen window, and there he pines away and dies, refusing to eat all food presented to him. And and they said he was green of skin. Now, that brought me to mind of something we talked about way back when, the green children.
Okay.
And it says, also from Suffolk was the story of the green children, where two children strayed from the fairy world, and the pair were captured by farmers. The boy soon died, and the girl learned to speak the English, and she told them that she came from a land deep inside the earth, and described a different world. They both had a greenish tint to their skin, and it said from time to time she would, when dredging up the fish and what have you, she was shocked by the fact that they ate fish. She thought that was an insane thing to do, because she had never seen it done in her world. In her world, they ate vegetables only. And she lived for several years. I mean, she lived to be an adult. And that story, is well documented in multiple places. There was a priest from the little village that wrote about it. In fact, he and the lady that worked for him, his housekeeper, raised the girl for several years, helped teach her teach her English and what have you. So there's a lot of really interesting stories. And there's another story from Shropshire, where Azrael, which is a goblin from the water, where somebody was fishing and they caught this young naked woman, green and fat and portly, and she was caught in the fishing nets. And when they pulled her out of the lake into the boat, they said as soon as she hit the air, she started to scream. She melted and away from the bottom of the boat as she fell into the bottom of the boat, as though she fell through it back into the water, as though as in an invisible state, she could pass straight through solid objects. So I just thought, this is something that just sort of caught my attention. And there are like 3 different types of stories you're going to see predominantly. The first are the captive fairy that dies, or the captive goblin that dies. So these are goblins that get caught in the human world, and there's many stories of stuff like that happened. We did the Brother Mike story would be something like that, where he couldn't eat or wouldn't eat the food and died. The second is the captive forced against her will. Near Lockerbie in Scotland, there's a story of a man who caught a gasting is the name of it. It's their word for for a goblin. And it is a shape-shifting goblin from mythology in Scotland, often appearing as a woman or a deer or a goat. It could be either benevolent or malevolent. I looked it up, and it is associated with deer, cattle, and hunting. And that this one was caught in the neighborhood. He imprisoned it in an outhouse. And as a condition of letting it go, he made it swear to leave the area and to not molest the population. For he blamed this particular being for the livestock dying and for other mysterious illnesses that were going on. And she did make that deal. And it said, but he and his family would thereafter be cursed with great bad luck, for she had promised to not harm others, but he forgot to ask about himself. There's another one I read about one that a man who caught one and he called it a magic belt. I don't know if it had incantations inscripted on it or something like that, but that he saw this woman. She asked him for a ride. It was an older woman, and he said, "Surely, but if you want to ride on my horse with me, you have to sit up front. I don't want you behind me." And she's like, "That's fine. I need a ride." So he pulls her up onto the horse, and as soon as she settles in, he grabs this magic belt and wraps it around her, and she starts to scream. And he's like, "Okay, so here's what we're going to do. You're going to make yourself into a young woman, and you're going to marry me, and you're going to give me my heart's desires, my treasures." And she agrees to it. But there's always a twist in these stories, like, so in this particular instance, she turns herself into a beautiful young woman. She does what he says, except that the minute he pulls the belt away, she fades into nothing and is gone. So, she promises, but she doesn't keep her word. So sometimes they can't. There's a story about it's called the dangerous glass tig of Lockerbie. And it says that there was a glass tig, which wasn't helpful or friendly in Lockerbie. It was an angry spirit who haunted a river near Ben Nevis. Anybody who crossed the river was risking their life, particularly after dark. There was a blacksmith by the name of Big Kennedy who heard the stories, but he wasn't scared. He had to cross the river, and as he approached it, he saw a frail-looking woman coming out of nowhere. She asked him if he could let her cross the river with him in his boat, okay? And he agreed. So as they start across the river, a storm suddenly blows up out of nowhere, and it gets really crazy. And she's like, "Give me one of the oars and I'll paddle." And he's like, "No, I think I'll just paddle because you're, old and weak, and I want somebody that's strong at the helm." And it gets worse as they're going along, and she screams, "Give me one of the oars and I will paddle." And so he finally, out of desperation, gives her an oar because he's got all he can do to hold on to the one and keep it moving. And he's got a two-hand on it because it's fighting against the wind and the rain and what have you. And to his absolute shock, suddenly she's doing this, like she's paddling that oar like she's this big, strong, burly dude, and she's like got the boat turned and it's heading in the right direction suddenly, and they paddle past other people other men who are paddling trying to get to the shore as well in this terrible storm that suddenly blew up. And he's absolutely shocked, and he says, he gets to the other side, he realizes she's not a human, she's got to be a goblin. And he grabs hold of her and he says some sort of a prayer, and she stops, and he says, "I want nothing from you except for this. I have cattle. I want cattle, and I want a barn on that piece of ground over yonder." And so she grants it. He says, "And you have till daybreak. And if by daybreak you can do these two things, I will let you go and we will call it even." And she goes, "Granted." And all of a sudden she begins to wail and scream and carry on. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "Hush." And all these other beings, fairies and elves and, brownies and what have you, come flying out of nowhere, out of the grasses and what have you. And she speaks to them in a language she doesn't understand. And she says, "Begone with you, for you have tricked me and you have lied, and I have saved your life this day." So he goes over to the woods nearby, and he lays down and he waits, and such a ruckus he had never heard in his entire life, thumping and carrying on and what have you. And just before daybreak, she appears at the edge of the woods where he's laying, and she says, "Come, I have kept my word." And he walks over, and there's this huge barn standing there that they have built throughout the night. And he says, "Fine, you kept your word. You gave me a barn, but there's no cattle." And she said, "Look but yonder." And he looks, and there are these beings, these other goblins, and they're touching the rocks. And as they touch them one by one, the rocks rise up and become cattle and head toward the barn.
I'd never heard that before, and I have been in Lockerbie. I didn't talk to any of the locals, so I'm kind of regretting not learning any local lore at that point. So
Yeah, I thought some of them were really, really interesting. So basically, you can hold them ransom and get something. It's kind of like, you know, with the elves, you can get something from them. Not so much gold, but they can grant a wish or do something for you. So people would try to catch them.
Hmm.
And then the captive fairies that escape is the last of the three types of stories that are traditional. So there's a tale about, and then I came across yet a fourth kind, which were goblins who serve witches, which I never knew about until I started doing this deep dive. So from England, there's a story of a woman. She was a real person. I want to make that completely clear. Her name was Anne Bodenham, and she was executed for witchcraft in 1653. And there were so many stories about Anne, I'm sure most of which were not true, but of course it was said that she had a pact with the devil, that she could teleport, that she could turn herself into a monkey, a wolf, a bear, a dog, or a lion, that she had the ability to conjure up spirits to do her bidding, and she had a group of goblins that many people saw. She called them her ragged boys. And she would say a spell, and these little gnomes, wearing just rags of clothing. They were young. Most people see gnomes, they always look old and wizened. These were young. And she would summon them to do all kinds of errands for her, fetch things for her, take care of things. And this anecdote comes from Against Atheism, and is the name of the book, and it's by Henry Moore. And so I wanted to read this. Now it's in an old English, so it's a little difficult. Bear with me a second if I have to stumble over a word. So she was employed by others in real negotiations twixt them and the witch, and ever brought back her answers to them. So she would employ them for this, receiving also things from her by the way of help of these young ragged boys she raised up. She appears in the third conjuration of hers, when a maid from another time sent to procure punishment for having wished to poison the two daughters of Mr. Goddard. So he tells a story about how the woman came and she entreated that this witch, give her a poison that she could kill the two daughters with. Why, they don't tell you in the story why she wanted to kill them, whether it was, because they slighted her in some way, or for money, or what it was. I don't know. But it says she sat, upon receiving the woman, she made a circle and set a pan of coals therein, and burnt something that stank extremely, and took her book and glass, as it is related, and said, Beelzebub, tormentor, Lucifer, and Satan appear. And then appeared 5 spirits that were in the shapes of her ragged boys, which the witch commanded to appear and to go with the maid to the meadow at Wilton, where she told them to find vervine and dill, which are herbs, and bring them forth. And then she proceeds to make this potion, if you will. There were 3 items in the potion, and they brought it back to her, and they said they found her sitting there in the circle paring her nails. And then she took the herbs and dried the same and made a powder and dried the leaves of the other and blew and threw bread at the boys to pay them for their deeds. So she paid them for their deeds, and they ate and danced merrily as the witch continued to make the powder. And then she tells this woman to do it. You know, you have to feed them the powder in their food, powder these nails and put them in their drink. There's different things to do. And then if you do all these during the one day, they will die. And it says that she did not follow through at the end because she was afraid of the boys. So this brought up another thing that you see a lot of, and that is humans paying off goblins. There are hobgoblins, and I wanted to know what a hobgoblin was. So I started looking, and I came to learn that a hobgoblin is a goblin that is domestic. So like it's attached to a castle or it's attached to a home, and they'll play pranks, but not terrible pranks. But they will also clean and tidy up and do stuff. So when we talk about the elves and the shoemaker, you know how the elves would come and make the shoes at night? They were most likely not elves. They were most likely goblins, hobgoblins, who would come in and do stuff for the family. They're either attached to a site like a castle, or they're attached to a home or a family, and they follow that family for a long time. They will, like for generations, follow this family. And there are stories of them at different castles where, you know, they would follow the family through the generations until the family died out. And when the family died out, the goblin would die.
Similar to the house elves in the Harry Potter world.
Yes. I've never seen Harry Potter, but I know because my son watched it. I saw bits and pieces, but I've never watched it all the way. You know, so I thought that was fascinating that there's been a relationship. It's the same thing with the goblins in the mines. If they were working in the mines, whether they were working voluntarily or not, they had to be paid. So you paid them with pans of milk or, you know, bread. Those are the two things that they mostly got. But you had to pay them in some way, or somehow it would become a curse on you. So there were things, I just thought it was fascinating. And it said that, you know, that they would often demand, they would help the miners. Or the men who were deforesting that area or whatever, but only if you paid them well. If not, then, you know, they'd set up things so that you'd have a mine accident or what have you. So the miners would actually, on every Friday, they would make sure that they brought milk or something with them, or maybe bread, a crust of bread or some cake or something. And they would put these little pans of it down in the mine as far as they could go so that they could feed these guys. And that's also the genesis of the Tommyknockers. So the Tommyknockers would be a kind of goblin. So the area I live in here, there was a story up in the mountains on the Broad Top. There was a story. The Broad Top is an area of Bedford County / Huntington. It's like right where the counties meet. And it's Bedford, Huntington, and Fulton counties all meet on the top of this mountain. And it's called the Broad Top. And there were lots of little coal mines up here. There were 2 or 3 really big coal mines, professional things. But then a lot of people either owned a little piece of ground that had coal in it and they dig it out and sell it, or they'd lease a piece of ground from one of the big mine companies, an area that they weren't working. And it was a win for the mine company because they could have somebody explore to see how rich the vein of coal was. And if it got really rich, then you just pulled the lease. You know, I mean, to be honest with you. But there are stories about Tommyknockers in that mine, in several of the mines up there, that the people up there believed in. And it makes a lot of sense, both culturally and not, because the Scotch, Irish, and German population mostly up there, some Welsh, and they would have brought those stories with them, but they would talk about hearing knocking and pounding in the mine, and it would either be they would feel like it was either a threat like, you're not paying us enough, so we want more. Or it would be a warning, like we want to warn you, don't come down today. There's something bad going to happen. And
Okay.
in order to do that, to keep the Tommyknockers or the goblins, happy with them, they would bring something for them. And I want to say that people need to understand that when I say a crust of bread or a little bowl of milk, like these people had nothing. Like they literally are hand to mouth. When they were digging out of that mountain, if they were leasing a piece of ground, that's what they had. They traded it for goods, somewhere. They didn't have much money. So that was a significant sacrifice for these people. And I just thought it was really an interesting story. So I found a story that happened in 1994, and I thought I would share this one. This story was actually told by somebody who had actually experienced it. So this gentleman was a young boy, about 6 years old in 1994. And this is here in the United States. He was at the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, and he was a Native American. His family lived on the reservation, his extended family, his grandparents and his aunts and uncles and stuff. And his father would come home to this little village and bring him, and they would visit for the weekend, visit the family. And he said he was out the reservation. He was 6 years old. He was playing outside while his grandfather and his uncles and his dad were sitting there drinking coffee and talking. And he said, I remember I was digging in the dirt. I was just a kid. I found a silver dollar in the ground, which seemed like a treasure, when you're 6.
Sure.
And he said, suddenly I knew I was being watched. And I looked up, and across the yard was a tree. And it was the first tree about 50 yards away. And he said, as I'm looking at the tree, I could see this building, or this being. And this being looked like the bark of a tree. Like it blended in. But when it moved, you could see it was distinctly humanistic in that it had 2 arms, 2 legs. It was a humanistic thing. And he said this thing was the same color as the bark of this tree. It looked like it was one, except when it moved. And he said its fingers were wrapped around the trunk, long and pointed, egg-shaped eyes, huge and hollow. The mouth had a smile that was like nothing I'd ever seen. It was staring at me. It was imagine the scariest part of a movie that you've ever seen, when you can't move, completely paralyzed. That's what was happening to this young boy. He said, I froze for a minute. Whatever it was, knew I was watching me. And I knew it. He said, and I knew not to meet its eyes. Somehow instinctually, I knew that was the wrong thing to do. He said, then something snapped, and I jumped up. I ran into the house, and I started to scream. I told my family what I had seen. I grabbed my father and started to pull him outside, screaming, "You have to see this. You've got to see this. It's real. It's real." He said, when we got outside, nobody saw anything, and I felt so stupid. But I knew it was real. I knew it was real. I told my father that. And my father said, we'll talk about it when we're back inside. And later that night, his father took him aside and said, my father told me that he had seen things like that on the reservation too, that he did not disbelieve me. And he said he knew I wasn't lying. And then he said, this was a goblin that was on the land, a goblin that had been there for a long time, and that it had been on the land when he grew up too. He knew who it was, and it was best to let it alone. And I just thought that was a really interesting story. Now, I had said something about there being Korean goblins, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So if you've ever seen the masks on the Chinese dragons, do you ever see the Chinese dragons, and they have those big masks, all the colorful things in the eyes and the whole 9 yards? Their goblins look a lot like that.
Wow.
And so they're much more ferocious, big mouth, pointy, slanted, egg-shaped eyes, I would say, and very rotund, very muscular. It's interesting. Korean goblins are very much the same way. And I was just really fascinated by this, and this is going to make no sense until I explain it to you. So I am reading a book called the Nephilim were clowns. And it sounds ridiculous, except that this guy started doing a deep dive on Nephilim back before the pandemic. Okay. And he said all of a sudden he had this, one of the things that demonic entities will look like from time to time, they'll take the shape of as a clown. There are, think about Pennywise.
I was going to say, yeah, Stephen King's It, that's
right.
Yeah.
But there's all these other stories about them and all of this. And he traces the lineage of the Nephilim and what they would have looked like and how they were described at the time frame. Because there's a lot of, like, people think that there's just that little bit of the information from the Bible, but there's a lot of other books, the book of Jasher, the book of Enoch. There are Egyptian texts that talk about this. There's texts from all over ancient Middle East that talk about this, and they describe them as having what we would call makeup. I mean, like they were Kellers. They were not made up. They were Kellers. Their skin was Kellers. Their eyes had like purple, like where behind their eyelids and stuff like that. They were essentially, they looked like clowns, or those masks that the Chinese dragons wear. And so when I'm looking at these things and I'm like, is it possible that these goblins are Nephilim? That might be the answer to this, because they fit that mold. This particular version of them anyway. It just was fascinating to me. Well, but not all Nephilim are tall. That was the interesting thing I learned about that. So there are Nephilim that are very small. Like these beings, if you read not just this book, but there's also something called the Genesis 6 conspiracy. There's another book, or a couple other books that have been written in the last 10 years about all of this. And they go into all these other ancient texts and pull all this material together. And not all the Nephilims were huge. There are Nephilims that are supposed to be really super huge, but there's others that are supposed to be very, very small. And I didn't know that.
News to me. Interesting that before, when you mentioned that they seem to respond to invoking the name of the Lord, that they would be, it fits. Yeah. At least, to that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I've heard of red caps before, but didn't know much about them. And I was really surprised when I was doing that read on them that they were talking about how the red caps responded. Like if you read Bible verses, they would disappear and they would leave you alone from that point forward. And I'm like, okay, so it's basically like what if you were talking to a demonic entity, it go away. And I thought that was interesting. And then as I got through the rest of this and I started looking at the pictures of them as depicted by the ancient descriptions, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's small versions of the things I'm seeing, in this book. And like I said, it sounds like it's a spoof until you start to read it. And then you're like, he's serious. The dude is serious. And he takes you back through all these ancient texts and says, this is what they said about him. This is how they did him. And that actually he makes the argument that like the clowns of today are actually based off of secret societies that would paint themselves up like the Nephilim to conjure them so that they could try to get information and get them to do things for them. And that's where the clowns originated from. And that, like many other things, we've lost the thread of the narrative.
And he shows you. Oh, go ahead. Let's see how many Nephilim we can pack into a car.
Well, just saying. But he's saying that these are humans that paint themselves up to try to conjure, these entities. But I just thought it was really interesting. And it was a completely different spin. And as I'm going down through it, I'm like hearing all these things. And I'm like, wait a second, that would fit two different worlds. So maybe there's a whole other side to this that we're not talking about. They don't seem to be attached to humans as a general rule. They seem to live independent of us. And they have a lot of the same qualities of anything that's paranormal. They can shapeshift. They can become invisible. They can make things happen like bad luck or kill people or animals or, control the weather. So it's a really different way of looking at all of that. And I found it fascinating. So if anybody that's listened to this particular podcast would like to add anything, either pro or anti-goblin, I'm okay either way, or, some theory on what you think they are, that would be cool too. I'm just throwing out a idea because, like I said, as I'm reading through all of this stuff, I'm seeing a lot of common themes. And with that, I am done.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And once again, if you're not already subscribed, please do consider subscribing and clicking the like. And with that, I think I will say good night.
Good night.